This is the Zealous Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder, and this week I've got Jacob Buffa on as my guest. He is the Director of Performance Science with the Houston Astros. We're going to talk all about baseball, conditioning, and what it takes to be World Series champs. Hope you enjoy it. Make sure you subscribe and tell others. And here we go. How about this? I noticed that you had some background learning with biomechanics in a program out of Cornell. I'd love to hear what they offer and why you chose that, and then how you're applying that information to the Astros.
Yeah, so I chose that certificate program out of Cornell's because it was actually primarily focused in deep learning applications, but there was a strong emphasis on linear algebra, just given that has a lot to do with some of the nuts and bolts of the deep learning algorithms. And so really the takeaways that I had from that was being able to apply like efficient mathematics calculations to like high dimensional data sets. There's a technical skill that comes with working with the raw biomechanics data. It's a larger data sets than most of us have ever dealt with before that didn't come from formal data science backgrounds, that weren't software developers or anything like that. So that was a skill set that I really wanted to obtain. And then given the volume of data as well, there's some more advanced, like I guess mathematical or modeling approaches that we can take that traditional sports science maybe hasn't been able to delve deep into when you only have a sample of 1, 2, 3, 400 data points. Now we're looking at samples of in the millions.
I see. Okay, so this changes my understanding in a way of what you're doing when it comes to biomechanics. So you're obviously not looking at the how would I say it, a hands-on. This is much more of an analytical approach of watching these curved lines coming through, like kinematic sequencing of a movement, force production at different rates of speed. This is what you're really talking about, right?
Correct. Yeah. So I think when most people think of biomechanics, they think of the very nice like Qualisys printouts and the pre-built software that comes in a lab, and that is certainly phenomenal. But most of our information comes from in games, and in games we get just the raw three-dimensional joint centers. So
yeah,
there's a lot of I guess for lack of a better term, like nitty-gritty work that has to go into making sure that the information is clean, making sure that it's reliable, quantifying the kinematics, and then delivering those reports and valuable insights. So we don't get the clean reports back, right off the bat that you might get from a lab.
So with all, I'll use the word minutia, all the smaller details, are there any revelations coming through since you've been kind of homing in on this, rather than looking at gross force production, but getting into those, into the minutia? What have you learned?
Honestly, I think the largest takeaway at the highest level of sport is that I don't know that we truly know as much as we had thought or would like to. I mean, there's so many different ways for athletes to be successful that I think if you were to get on social media, you'll find a lot of people breaking down deliveries, showing where pitchers go wrong, and you find a lot of like quote unquote truth or fact from people on social media. But when you get into the highest level of performance from what we've seen during competition in games, we see success come in a lot of different ways. And I don't know that we've truthfully pinned down what an ideal biomechanical model would look like. In some ways, that's a revelation in and of itself, right? Where we can begin to stop putting players in boxes.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the nail because I was as you're explaining it, I'm thinking, wow, how is it that human nature wants to categorize or classify? We need to organize our thoughts in these columns and rows and make it something that is understandable when every individual that hits the field is unique to the way in which they move, unique to the joint positionings of their body, the shape of the joint capsule. I mean, I'm just thinking about the hip joint and the pelvis and how many different types of squats based on the person's yeah, skeletal makeup. So it must be it must be a blessing and a curse to realize that maybe we don't categorize every player, but treat them as an individual, which of course is requiring so much more work and attention. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where we're fortunate. I'm sure every club feels this way, but I feel very strongly that with the Astros, we have a phenomenal set of coaches like across the board. So this is where we can communicate with them, we can provide insight, but we don't have to provide the answers. We can just provide certain levels of information and let these coaches who see these players on a daily basis interact with them, know them on a personal level. They're the ones that can really make the transformations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I actually had one of your colleagues, Nick Shed, on about a year ago, and I was just blown away by the Astros organization and the size and scope of the coaching staff that's there. I mean, you guys are in a candy store as far as I'm concerned in my world. That's amazing to have such amazing tools and professionals at your disposal. So I am curious though, with the information that you're getting with biomechanics, are you as hard as it is to get away from categorizing and classifying, are you seeing trends with certain size players, certain kind of somatotypes, shall we say? Are there certain kind of things that are common that you're going to see amongst this type of player versus that type of player?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think from a very basic level, we can look at, how, let's just take like fastball velocity, for example, or exit velocity, hitting a ball hard or throwing a baseball hard. You accomplish that through efficient transfer of momentum. And, you can transfer momentum, or you can generate momentum one of two ways. You can generate it from either being really big or being really fast. Or a combination of both. And so you're definitely going to see athletes lean towards one subset or another. And I don't think it's like any industry secret that you're going to see the smaller guys probably have to move faster, and the bigger guys can afford to move a little bit slower and generate equal amounts of momentum. Like I do think that there are certain truths like that hold true, and then with that comes probably a cascading effect of, if you want to generate higher amounts of velocity, you might need higher degrees of separation between the hips and torso. And, you might be a little bit more rotational, whereas someone who is a little bit bigger, doesn't need to rotate quite as much, might be able to be more direct, more linear. These are just very generic, I think, like physics-based principles rather than specific to player archetypes. I think we're just breaking down how physics might work in general.
Okay, so with the analytics that you're doing with the breakdown of biomechanics, so all the minutiae you spoke of there, all the details, how do you communicate that over to the trainers, the coaches, the players? I mean, what would that look like in terms of the information that you're acquiring in your head and getting it to the players or the people that need it?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think that differs a lot, the approach that people take. We met a lot of biomechanists that prefer to be the people that do the interpreting and relaying the information, and maybe even giving the information to the players themselves, because obviously they're best suited to understand what they're looking at. We prefer to take a different approach. ideally, we like to be the ones, we prefer to educate our coaching staff, really. And that's, we're going to educate them basically to the level of knowledge that we have on the information. You know, what does the rotational plane of movement look like relative to the shoulders, relative to the hips? You know, what is when we're talking about torso tilt or flexion, you know, what does that look like anatomically? What does that look like in the delivery? And we can provide meaningful visuals back to coaches to educate them. But ultimately, I think the largest success comes from if our coaches are biomechanists, you know, if they're the biomechanical experts, then I think that's where the largest impact comes from. So then what allows us to do is it allows us to just give them vast amounts of information, you know, whether it be actual like raw time series traces of certain joints, or just metrics themselves, you know, peak rotational values, things like that. They're able to digest that information then, and then they can be the filter back to the players and relay what they believe will be useful and what they think might not be useful. But ultimately, our best approach, I think, is to educate the coaching staff as much as we possibly can.
So once they understand the joint mechanics and the proper amount of rotation at different segments of the body, that must turn into a very unique assessment tool. I mean, they must go, okay, well then, aside from watching this whole integrated motion of throwing a ball or hitting a ball, let's break it up into these components. Let's see how much rotation is the cervical spine going through, how much is the thoracic, what's happening at the hip, what's happening at the knee. Is this kind of happening? Are they doing a joint by joint approach to understand where is there the least amount of restriction, where is the most? How can we get the ideal numbers?
Yeah, I think to an extent, but we always like to start with performance. So because I do think it's possible to achieve outlier performance with what we might perceive as like suboptimal inputs. And so we will always start with performance. Basically, you know, maybe it's a pitcher that has that we want him to improve fastball velocity. Maybe it's a pitcher that has trouble finding the strike zone. You know, we're always going to start with some type of on-field performance and then work our way back. So that way we are not, we're not creating problems where there aren't problems, if that makes sense. So
sure.
If a pitcher throws sufficiently hard and maybe doesn't rotate quite as fast as other pitchers, we're not going to fix that rotation because he already throws hard. But if a pitcher doesn't throw hard, right, and then has those issues, we will address them. So I do think we like to start from the macro level first and say, okay, well, what does their on-field performance look like? And then let's attack the largest, like lowest hanging fruit, if you will. And that usually comes from like the bigger, larger areas. And then we may, if it warrants it, then we may get down to some of the detailed, like joint by joint specifics with the player. But ultimately we try not to, because if we relay enough information to the player that he starts to think about it too much, starts to slow down, that can be like a player by player basis, where some players may not want all of the information. They may just want a simple cue from a coach in a single rep, and then they may want to feel good or bad based off of that cue.
Yeah, you mentioned outliers, and it makes, those are the players that I get excited about. I don't know about you, but the ones that don't stick to the ideal model, they're the ones that are showing something different, showing something new. Do you feel the same way when it comes to the non-traditional player coming up and just cracking one out of the park, or the unassuming guy that steps on the mound and just throws a fastball at 102 or whatever? I mean, and they don't look like they could. I mean, that must get your juices flowing, does it?
So I do think, like, intellectually, I love to look at those players because I think when we find those outlier players, my take on it actually is that those are the players that help us whittle down closer and closer to ground truth. Because there can be a lot of noise in what we look at, and we can start to fabricate different, the player A is successful because of this, or player B is successful because of this. But ultimately, I think true innovation comes from understanding like first principles of the problem that you're looking at. And those outliers actually, I think, help us whittle down to what the true first principles actually are. Because if they're successful in a manner that would be deemed outlierish, maybe it's total body size, right? Then you can say, okay, this player throws 98 miles an hour, weighs 170 pounds. We previously thought that body weight was imperative to throwing hard. We can actually now remove body mass as like a first principle component. This is just an example. Like you can take these outliers and say, okay, well, if this didn't hold true, then obviously what we're looking at is not ground truth. Let's try and get closer and closer to what holds true for every single player.
Yeah. Okay. I want to just change direction a little bit, because I want to talk about you as a professional, Jacob. You've been with the Astros organization for several years now, but it looks like, based on your background, you were very much into baseball. So I'm curious, how many years of baseball did you play?
So I played all the way through college, and then, all the way through high school, and then up until college is when I stopped. I got more into developing physical performance. Then I was someone who was always a lot smarter than I was athletic. So I got to college in Missouri State and realized that it was not going to continue on for me after college. And I was on an academic scholarship at the time, so I wasn't going to lose any money or anything like that. So I decided to just be a student. But I really did truly love the idea of like physical development. I love to sprint, jump, lift. I love to do all those things. So that's kind of where my passions took me after I was done playing.
Now, that's what I was wondering, because you jumped into the science aspect of it. Was it because of your own physical development? Was it just what you saw as a team? What do you think was it that inspired you to follow this direction?
That's a good question. I think the first thing that inspired me towards physical development is just the idea of you can perform physically and you can perform mentally. I think that baseball had always been labeled like a thinking man's game, and just through my playing career, I saw that wasn't really true. Like, I saw some of the best athletes be the best baseball players. And so one thing I was really passionate about is, you always want to throw the baseball hard, right? You always want to hit the baseball far. Those are probably the two biggest key performance indicators. And so I was passionate about being able to help other athletes throw the baseball harder and hit the baseball further. And to me, it seemed like very simple that those were both physical qualities. And I go back to, I think you could count, the early 2000s, late 90s of baseball as probably I call it like the largest like on-field experiment in the steroid era. I think it shows you exactly what size and strength does to a baseball player. It helps you hit the ball harder and further. And so that's I think what drew me towards that physical quality. I wasn't necessarily a hitting coach or a pitching coach, but I did have a passion for throwing the baseball hard is sexy, and I think we had a passion for developing that quality in players, and that led me down the physical route.
And so what led you to the Astros? How did the Astros pick you up? How did they find out about you?
That's another great question. Probably it's unique to my background. So I I have a double major in economics and marketing, and it's not in strength and conditioning at all. It has nothing to do with like sports science. But after I was done playing and I got into coaching, I started a performance company in St. Louis, Missouri, and one of the things that I was really never able to do is I was never able to be a strength conditioning coach in a professional setting, like for a collegiate or professional team, because I didn't have formal degree in that area. And most of them required a degree in kinesiology or something like that. And out of college, I started my first business, so I never really applied to any jobs. Well, the Astros, occasionally I had applied to some collegiate strength and conditioning jobs just to see, and I was turned down to all of them. And the Astros opened up a role that was called performance coach, and it was a hybrid role. It was an on-field coach that also needed a background in strength and conditioning. It needed to be able to run warm-ups, do sports science testing, things like that. And so when I saw that, I thought, well, this is a good of time as any just to test my resume out and see what it's like. So I submitted an application fully expecting to get rejected, like I had to all of the other applications that I submitted in the college world. But I didn't. I had an interview, went on through the interview process, and they actually wound up offering me the position. And at the time, I had just thought, you know what, this is something I can do for a year. It's going to be a really great experience. I'm going to learn a lot. And if nothing else, it will pad my resume for when I come back. Who doesn't want to train with someone that worked in professional baseball? So I thought it would be a very good resume builder and be a great experience. And so that's how I wound up with the Astros.
But then that role changed and evolved over the last 3 or 4 years, hasn't it?
Yeah. So my first year, I was an on-field coach for the short season team, and actually primarily doing baseball activities, coaching first base, doing outfield defense, base running, with a little bit of a sports science emphasis. I did help with some of the data collection process. And then in year 2, that's when they actually moved me fully into sports science. So they kind of asked me what I wanted to do. They had sports scientists at the time, Jose Fernandez. He was a really great mentor for me. We worked really well together, and he gave me the opportunity to come on staff as the second sports science analyst for the Astros. And so I spent 2 years working as a sports science analyst for them. 2020 was the COVID shortened season, and then all of 2021. And then that was in 2022, we created a performance science department, and the Astros allowed me to lead that department now.
And it seems like many teams in the MLB are doing the same thing. You're no exception, right? I mean, sports science and performance science are just emerging, and it's not simply a changing of titles from the strength coach or whatever. They're actually delving into a lot more of the science. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think you can look across the league, and some of the best clubs in baseball, the Rays, the Dodgers, the Yankees, they all have performance science departments. And to your point, I think it's because there's enough data and information available that it requires a new staff, a different skill set, and it requires heavy integration with strength conditioning and on-field coaches. But it is its own job in its entirety now. And I think what we're seeing is that clubs, they really want to maximize on player potential. I mean, I think it's also like the most exciting time to be a player in these sports, because clubs are making heavy investments in these players' careers as far as making sure that we do everything that we possibly can to maximize the output of these players on the field and give them the best chance to make the big leagues.
Yeah, I'm wondering how many players feel like they're Well, I can't say that there's a lot of wearable tech, but there is wearable tech that the players choose to wear. And I know that between players' organizations and the league and so on, there's some privacy concerns. I will share this information on my own behalf if I choose to. But do any of the players feel like they're laboratory rats? Do you get that?
Yeah, so I would like to say on our end, so first of all, like absolutely, it's very easy to make a player feel like that. I mean, it's probably way easier than we would like to admit to make a player feel like that. One of the things that we try and do on our end is we really do our best to make it optional. I mean, we're certainly going to push these technologies because we believe that they're best for our players. But at the end of the day, if a player says no to us, we're not going to punish them in any way. We're not going to hold it against them. We're not going to treat them any differently. They're all more than happy. We encourage them to voice their opinions, to express their concerns, and to, quite frankly, just say no if they believe it's going to inhibit their performance. So we hold ourselves to a standard of, like, if a player tells us no, then we go back to the drawing board and try and provide a higher level of proof to the player until we can convince the player that it's beneficial to do. But I would say across the board, our players are outstanding. And I really do think that a lot of these players do want the information, at least to an extent. And most of the players are willing to give it a try if they think it's going to help them.
Well, they're on a World Series championship team. They're willing to try and have that repeat this year again. So all of the information that you're already taking in, I'm sure there's like sleep patterns, there's levels of hydration, of course there's some levels of nutrition, but are there things within that or outside of that in the ethers that you're going, man, I would like to get a better understanding of this? If we could just draw this into the overall equation, I think that's going to put us on an even tighter track.
Yeah, so I give kind of two versions of an answer to this because I think it's a really good question, and part of me might take a contrarian view to what other people might answer. So I think first and foremost, the number one thing that we would like to personally, like I would like to get a better idea of is internal workload or internal stress, because I think that allows us to help mitigate injuries a lot better. We truthfully, I think if anyone says that they can really, predict injuries, they're being a little bit generous with their verbiage. I do think it's possible to get an idea of risk factors and then mitigate those risk factors. Absolutely. But, we would really love to, we're missing a lot of information to be able to accurately say a player is at risk for an elbow injury or a player is at risk for a hamstring injury. And I think a lot of that comes from internal stresses, whether it be hormonal or, you touched on like a lack of sleep, how players are adapting or adjusting to less than ideal inputs from their body. That's something that I don't know that we'll ever get to in my setting. It might be something that needs to be done in the lab first, because, to your previous question, there's only so many things we're going to subject our players to. So that's something that, like, on a grand scale, like, absolutely, I would love to get a better understanding of that type of information to help mitigate injuries for our players. But then, you touch on all these other areas: sleep, nutrition, and what's something we want more information on. I think that this is where might be slightly boring or a contrarian take, but I am someone who's hyper focused on execution, and I truthfully don't believe that we have executed like perfectly. And I will preface this by saying I don't think we're ever going to execute perfectly. And there's a lot of players and a lot of factors go into a absolute perfect development plan. So sleep is a really good one. I I don't think we need to study sleep like super in depth to understand that most of our players are not getting enough sleep when they sleep 4 or 5 hours a night. And I think there's enough information out there to show what that does to the body. And so that's an example of somewhere that I don't know that we're ever going to perfectly execute and get every player to sleep 8 to 9 hours a night. I don't know that that will ever happen, but I am someone who would like to pursue that and invest as many resources as possible to help accomplish that. So actually, you mentioned Nick Shedd, a colleague of mine. Nick is one of the brightest minds in this area, especially as it comes to S&C, and he's super passionate about pushing this area. And it's something that I try and learn from him often on sleep and how it impacts performance and things like that, because he's very knowledgeable. And I think he's going to do a tremendous job for us in helping improve on the execution of better sleep for players. Nutrition. We just hired a phenomenal dietitian, Taylor Lyle, who she's going to help improve on the execution of getting our players to eat the prerequisite amount of calories, get the correct macronutrients, micronutrients, help facilitate recovery. So, when it comes to investing resources, it's not necessarily more information that I am passionate about. It's bringing in people like Nick and Taylor who will help us perfect the execution of this for our players.
Right on. Yeah, it seems not that all elements have been exhausted, but they have been covered. That's what I get a sense that even the clothing, the shoe wear, the diet. I mean, I think just short of knowing what the proper haircut is for aerodynamic speed around the plates, I love your answer. I think it's great that you're really homing in on sleep. And I could honestly see there being a small room behind the dugout where there are these nap chambers or something where they could just go and pass out for an hour or so before the game. But when it comes to the season and the progression going from preseason spring training through the beginning of the season into the belly of the summer and on into the playoffs, with the information that you're detecting with biomechanics, do you see trends? Do you see changes? And through the season, is there by now there's been a couple years that you've been watching this, but are there trends that occur? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like on the biomechanics front, I think people might be surprised to actually learn about the lack of systematic trends through the season as far as it relates to specific techniques. For two reasons. On the pitcher front, these guys, their delivery is so ingrained in them, and they're excellent compensators where on like a macro level, even if these guys are feeling fatigued or not feeling their best, they're able to still accomplish the task that they set out to accomplish, very similarly to how they would do it at the beginning of the season or at the end of the season. It does look very similar. And I think the margin for error that we're talking about when you're trying to locate a 98-mile-an-hour fastball is so small and so minute. It is like it's very difficult to detect. And so that's where I think that these players do a phenomenal job of performing at the highest level throughout the entire season. On the hitter front, the answer is the same, but for a different reason. Personally, I was surprised at when you take a look at some of the information. When you look at hitter like in-game swings, there's a lot of variance between swings. And I think if you go back and look at a baseball game and you look at all of the swings that hitters take at different pitch types and different locations, it makes sense. There's multiple roads that lead to successful batted ball outcomes. So all that to say that I would say it's fairly difficult to actually detect systematic trends throughout a season. But if you look closely, I think you can I think there's some signal around identifying, when a pitcher's shoulder gets tired, maybe when their lead leg mechanics start to differ. I think there is a little bit of signal around that, even within outings, but sometimes it's difficult to know like what's the significant change and what is just possibly a bad rep, because
Gotcha.
they do happen. So that's kind of my long-winded answer to say I don't know that we see actually systematic trends across players throughout the season as it relates to in-game kinematics, but there are other trends that you do see hold true as far as chronic fatigue. Players do accumulate fatigue over the course of a season, and you can see that in maybe decreased ranges of motion in certain areas, maybe decreased force production, throughout a season if they're not diligent with their lifts, or overall fatigue.
So does that send like red flags to you when you begin to see this reduced force production, lessened range of motion? Do those send up like, okay, we need to keep an eye on this guy, because not that you can predict injuries, but I mean, those are probably adding up to a path that could give a greater likelihood of an injury to occur. I mean, is that what you take that information, you take it over to the athletic trainer, or what does that look like? Or am I even out of the ballpark with that?
No, I think you're spot on, and this is where we lean heavily on a phenomenal S&C and medical staff, but they will. So to a certain point, we can try and reduce on-feet workload if we see something like that happen, but you're not going to necessarily sacrifice the games that they're playing, right? Because they have to compete. They have to go out and do their job. They want to compete. So taking them off the field of competition is not necessarily the answer. But we can, Nick is very creative in the way that he may modify conditioning. Maybe instead of running, maybe it's on a bike. Maybe we're taking one or two less sprints. Maybe we're doing, half the amount of conditioning for that given player. Medical staff, they can go in and they can get treatment, if it's shoulder fatigue or something like that, or we see decreased range of motion in certain joints. Our medical staff is phenomenal at being able to rehabilitate that, give the player like an actionable plan. And then we can even include the dietitian in that and be able to prescribe foods to facilitate recovery, whatever the issue might be. So our coaching staff and S&C medical dietitian, they are very much aware of the information. They stay on top of it as well. We help provide some of those insights, but they're ultimately the ones that will take a look at that. They will put their heads together and decide, what the best plan of action is for the player, and then monitor, our key metrics that we're looking for of that player over the next several weeks or months.
Okay, I think this will probably be one of my coming up to second to last or last question here, is that of course, Moneyball being one of my all-time favorite baseball movies, it's probably in the top 5. Of course, I could list a whole bunch of them, but the thing about Moneyball was they looked at a sport that's been around for 100 years, and they found a new way of looking at it to create championship teams, and they're using that model even to this day. You've got a lot of information. You've got a lot of analytics. Are there things that would kind of be under that Moneyball category where you're looking, going, wow, I'm seeing this. I'm seeing this so often, but no one's looking at it. And this is one of those pivotal ingredients, these key ingredients for getting on base or getting the ball over the plate faster. Are there any things, not that you have to give away any trade secrets, I don't want to give away from the Astros recipe for success, but are there things that you're scratching your head at when you're looking at all your information?
Oh man, that's a good question. So I think one of the, I think we're pretty early on in the process, actually. So if if we were to equate this to the Moneyball era, I think we're still probably a couple years away from having those huge Moneyball, like generational type insights. But what I can say I think is extremely beneficial is ultimately there's so much noise in on-field outcomes for baseball players. We can go back to a pain point for the Houston Astros in the 2019 World Series where Howie Kendrick hit the home run off of Will Harris, and you can look at that pitch and you can say that may have actually been the most perfectly executed pitch of the at-bat. It just wasn't the outcome that we wanted, and that's like a really good example of noise in performance. And so the entire history of baseball is trying to sift through that noise to better help players improve. And I think right now we're as close to ground level as we've ever been in being able to evaluate strategies and outcomes, and ultimately help coaches have a better idea on, if they're trying to work on something very nuanced for players. Let's say they're trying to work on some type of breaking technique for a breaking ball. You may only get 15 to 20 actual repetitions in a game to be able to evaluate off of. And out of, let's say, those 15, there may be 5 or 6 that have some noise in that sample that don't have optimal outcomes. But we can actually now start to evaluate on the strategy that is being coached. So, if we're trying to look for specific release points, if we're trying to look for specific arm angles, we can evaluate on more granular metrics and help our players improve at a really faster rate. And I think ultimately that's where we're going to see the largest impacts is, we're seeing players reach the big leagues now at 21, 22, 23 years old, like it's commonplace. And that has really never happened in the history of the game before. And so I think in the future years, we will see stuff like that. Right now, I don't think there's any unfortunately, there's no large takeaways other than we feel confident that we have the best process around developing and evaluating our players that we've ever had before.
Yeah, I'm curious, just a side question. You mentioned the young players coming up, and there's so many that it's becoming quite prevalent. Why is that? Why do we have the 20 to 21-year-olds that are appearing in the big leagues when they should be going through but they typically go through the farm systems and make their way from AAA up to the minors and so on?
I think there's 2 reasons for that. The first reason that I don't know is spoken about much is I think the training that's provided at the amateur level across the board is light years better than it's ever been. I mean, certainly you're not going to find, certainly every training facility is not amazing, but I know some phenomenal coaches and some phenomenal training facilities that are training players at an elite level already, and they're focusing on major league ready pitch types. They're focusing on major league ready swing qualities at the high school level. And I remember being in high school, and it was not like that. So players, I think, are coming out of high school and college better than they've ever been. And the second reason is because I think, we're never going to be 100% accurate with our prescriptions for players. We do know, what leads to high levels of performance, but then, there could be a plethora of a dozen different drills, that we could try with a player. Over the years, we can whittle that drill set down. Instead of trying a dozen drills in year 1, maybe in year 2, we're only trying 10. And then in year 3, we're only trying 6. And so basically what that does is it eliminates it basically helps speed up the process. If we're going from 12 drills down to 6 drills, now we're operating within a much narrower bandwidth that allows us to speed up the development process of the player. And I think those would probably be the 2 major reasons that come to mind.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, final question, Jacob, is that if we've got somebody in the listening audience who maybe didn't have their master's or bachelor's of science in kinesiology, but chose economics or something like that, but they really loved sports, so they essentially want to try and follow your path. What's the best way for them to do that? What do you recommend? What suggestions do you give?
I love that question because obviously it hits home for me. I would say like specific examples is pick a question that you're curious about and then pursue the answer to that question as relentlessly as you possibly can. There's free resources everywhere. So the question for me that first got me started when I was in strength and conditioning was, I was not a believer that just because an athlete squatted more or deadlifted more, that they were going to be a better baseball player. I didn't think that was a one-to-one correlation. And I had seen enough players, quite frankly, like I had seen enough players at the high school level that threw 90 miles an hour that never lifted. Then I had seen, vice versa. Players that lifted 400 pounds didn't always throw 90 miles an hour. So I was curious about what the connection was. Like, what are we actually training in the weight room to help on-field performance? And then, that leads down into force production, which leads, and then you have to assess force production, which leads into force plate research. And so I relentlessly pursued the answer to that question for years on my own. And along the way, you have to develop skill sets to be able to answer these questions. So, first it was having to understand basic physics terminology. And then it was having to understand force plate research. And then once I collected my own data, it was having to learn how to code and having to learn how to do linear regression to find answers. And so I think if you pick a question you're passionate about and you just pursue online resources and continue to learn the necessary skill sets to find that answer along the way, I think that's the most fun way to do it, because you're enjoying the process and you may not even realize the skill sets that you're picking up along the way.
Yeah, great advice. And this has been a really great conversation. I appreciate all your insight, all your answers. You just got my head scratching and thinking about all the things that occur behind the scenes when we watch a game. So thank you so much. If people just want to reach out, is it okay that I share a little contact information with them on the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful. Then that's what I'll do. Jacob, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rocky.
Man, that was such a fun conversation. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. Thank you, Jacob, and the Houston Astros organization for coming on and talking all about, conditioning, baseball, and everything we covered. And make sure if you want to subscribe, if you haven't already, that way you don't miss out on each weekly episode, because every new one airs Monday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific. And we'll see you next week.